Now I'm going to introduce our secretary to India, Africa, and the rest of the world, Brother Sri Sina.
Thank you, Mike, for that introduction. And may I just say mad props to one of our earlier speakers, Brother Mike Kearsley, for slipping in a reference to cricket during his Q&A session. Our next presenter, ladies and gentlemen, I take great pleasure in introducing him, is Ben Williams. The title of his paper is Freemasonry in Pike country, which is, of course, a reference to the gold mining region of the western United States, which is now part of modern-day Colorado. After the discovery of gold in 1858, European settlement began in Colorado in earnest. Everywhere along the frontier, men fought to manifest destiny. Amidst the rush to statehood and in the excesses afterward, Masonry plied a gentle craft to extend a civilizing ray here in the American West. Ben Williams is a past Grand Commander of the Grand Commandery of Colorado, an active Grand Officer of the Grand Encampment of the United States of America, and recipient of the Mason of the Year Award from the Grand Lodge of Colorado. So without further ado, Brother Ben, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Brother Sri. Just want to make sure everyone can hear me okay. I'll take that as a yes.
Yes, you're audible. Yes.
Okay, thank you. First, thank you guys for putting this together. This is a wonderful compendium, which I strongly recommend. It's a great honor to be included among its pages with such luminaries. So thank you for this opportunity, brethren. So Freemasonry in Pike's Peak country. I guess the founding of the state of Colorado owes much to the role of Freemasonry. I think one of the interesting case studies that Colorado and Masonry in Colorado represents, and can we go to the next slide? Actually, I think it might work. Is how Freemasonry was plied to unify different factions and really establish, if you will, representative governance and the tools necessary for forwarding, this new society that was coming in through from both sides of the coasts. So about 1850s, 1860s, the Western world had encroached on both sides of what was known as Louisiana, which was then this giant territory stretching from the Gulf of Mexico, about 828,000 square miles, all the way up to Canada. And it loosely sort of borders the Rocky Mountains and the Great Prairies. So it was a rather challenging landscape. And you can see these guys crossing the South Platte here from an 1859 representation to get to the new settlement. So I think Masonry and the thesis that I try to explore, which I think is pretty typical of Freemasonry on the frontier, was that Masonry presents three kind of central tenets. First, we could say that it presents a kind of nexus for relief and mutual support. I think that one's very important. Secondly, I think it supplies a kind of moral code, a kind of legislative format for the binding of people together in a type of civility. Often it's transactional, but nonetheless, it does give this kind of mythos, this shared moral background. And then lastly, of course, it gives the forum for this self-governance, these principles of assembly and self-governance to be practiced. And we see that very, very clearly in the founding of Denver. So quite exciting about Colorado, of course. The discovery of gold brings people from all over the country, from all different socioeconomic backgrounds, many of which are just searching for that, quick fortune that the discovery of gold represents. But among these are a lot of people that come to literally set up a town, to stake their claim, right, to carve up the land and get rich through ownership. And I think nowhere is that more clear than the founding of Denver, where the only town that was officially incorporated by act of state legislature. And let me preface this by saying, of course, that this was Indian country. This was country that had been given by treaty back to the Native Americans, and there was probably no lawful incorporation whatsoever. But nonetheless, St. Charles, the township of St. Charles, had received its charter by lawful warrant through the through the Kansas legislature in February of 1859. And in so doing, it became the first town to be lawfully incorporated. It is perhaps of interest that it is also the only town that never existed, because by the time the charter was issued, the claim had already been jumped. And I think what is salient about this is across the river, across this Platte River here on the other side, The second settlement, and probably the first actual settlement, had already been founded by the Russell brothers. And they were all Masons. They'd come out from Georgia. They'd come out looking for gold on reports of Cherokee discoveries several years earlier. And they had built their log cabin at this point, and they began to build Auraria. And what we see that is so fascinating in the founding of Denver is these Masonic brethren who began the formation of Auraria and were much more successful, not only in banding together and giving each other this mutual support, but even in drafting things like bylaws and the law of the land. And they were able to keep their town, and it flourished. In fact, back in like 1860, the most expensive lots in the new town plats were in Auraria. Now, oddly enough, the Leavenworth party comes in from Kansas. One Mason maybe among them, or who joins later on, but really led by a very, very bullish personality, a guy called William Larimer Jr., who was, there's Larimer Street in Denver named after him, to this day. He basically came out there as an experienced town promoter, is the term that a guy called Jerome Smiley uses in his History of Denver that was collated about 1901. So mostly living reports informed the history collated in that vast tome, which I've got seated over there. And so William Larimer Jr. and his team basically stole the St. Charles claim, the exact outline. They didn't build any improvements on it. And they go about their business in getting rich. Meanwhile, the Masons grow on their side. And Jerome Smiley even notes in his history that there was much more of the brotherly love element among the Auraria enterprise, and that their notes have a much more practiced hand in framing the laws and in forwarding kind of a mutual system for the discovery of each his own wealth and each his own potential, perhaps. Whereas the Denver City Town Company was a hodgepodge of entries that seemed to be loosely organized because obfuscation might have been indeed expedient in their enterprise. Nonetheless, there are many, many, many great stories, and I wanted to share one about this time period. Let me say this too. I probably should jump back. So. It's about June of 1858 when the Russell party first arrived. This is William Green Russell, Levi Russell, and Oliver Russell. They're three brothers. They're three Masons, three real brothers. They've come all the way from Georgia. And, they pan around. They go up into the mountains. They go up north. They go down south. They find some nuggets. They find some flake. They get enough gold that they decide to stay. And Levi builds his cabin with the help of a guy called John Simpson Smith, who was married to a Cheyenne bride. There were two Westerners who were sort of living and trading in the region. One was called William McGaw, who went by the name Jack Jones, a very interesting character, would die in the Denver jail, unfortunately, in the early 1860s, probably from alcohol-related withdrawal, sadly. And then John Simpson Smith. Both of these characters become shareholders in all of the towns that are incorporated because their participation was deemed necessary. But so by November, so by the time they built this cabin, Levi is coming back from Fort Garland down by the New Mexico border, and he's coming back, and people are beginning to arrive, but his cabin is still the first. Literally within 3 weeks of his return, there is a Masonic meeting that is held in his cabin. 3 days after that, they incorporate the township of Auraria, and so the history of Denver begins. Really, in a sense, with this Masonic meeting. But let me read you, just to give you a sense of the atmosphere. So this is from George Byers Clark, who is a descendant of William Newton Byers, who was a brother who arrived and set up the Rocky Mountain News. He was a very influential and important Mason, not just in the founding of Denver, but also in Omaha, Nebraska. So this is the St. John's Day Feast, the first St. John's Day feast ever shared in the Rocky Mountains in a Masonic milieu. So when December 27th of 1858 came, there arose in the little Auraria group the true Masonic desire to celebrate St. John's Day in a fitting manner. A sumptuous dinner was prepared for the 26 Masons who had now arrived. The story of this banquet has become a classic in Colorado Masonic history. The room, a 16 by 16 foot cabin, tablecloth, a clean sheet borrowed from a Mormon family recently arrived. Chairs, none. Menu, pork, beans, biscuits, coffee, wild game. But it was a St. John's Day feast, regularly celebrated for the first time in this prairie wilderness. And I think that really gives you some sort of feeling. By 1859, in June, so maybe a year later after they first arrived, gold had been discovered up at Gregory Gulch, and now they build the first Masonic temple. That's also a wonderful record that is relayed by, I believe it was William McFadden. And, they built this wonderful wood cabin. They had tilers with rifles at each of the four corners. And they basically had this huge Masonic meeting on the side of the hill, probably about St. John's Day, John the Baptist Day in the summer, June 24th, where they all met and networked and kept their interests alive, as well as each other alive in this sort of otherwise anarchic world. So can I go to the next slide? I was asked what I discovered, and there were many things that I discovered in researching this. Number one, I got to the bottom of which lodge really is first. There's been a long-standing feud in Colorado as to whether or not Golden City number 1 is the oldest lodge or Denver number 5 is the oldest lodge. And I can tell you that Denver number 5 is probably the oldest lodge. But in so doing, I came across this interesting character here, William Train Muir. Now, he was the notary public appointed for the region in 1860. But here he is, about 1860, in his full Knight Templar regalia. Now, this is of interest because there is no record of any Templary being conducted in Colorado at all. And I got into a good discussion with a good friend of mine who was the Worshipful Master Research Lodge of Colorado over this very picture. And during that discussion, it was determined that, in fact, he was appointed to the Committee of Arrangements by Grand Commander, I'm going to have to remember his name, it's James Van Zant Blaney. I think I read that right, Blaney, James Van Zant Blaney, in 1859. So July 5th, William Train Muir is appointed by the Grand Commander of Illinois to the Committee of Arrangements to assist in arranging the triennial, which is the 3-yearly event for the Grand Encampment that was occurring in Illinois that year. And we see him leave Colorado in 1859, and then he comes back in 1860, and he's got this wonderful little blurb in the newspaper, the Rocky Mountain News, that says, "We are pleased to see our friend Judge Muir of Nevada City back again from the States. He appears to have enjoyed the trip over the plains. The judge has been appointed notary public for the mountain region." Now, he was the judge in the miners' court. Now, aside from Masonic law, that was essentially, unspoken law that was really binding the movers and shakers of these early societies together, and the law that they promulgated as bylaws for the town incorporations, such as the selling of lots and how to notice people and what the prices would be and all that kind of stuff, was really the mining law. So here we have the first judge of the mining court up in Nevadaville, which is way up in the hills there near Central City and, the mining enclave around Gregory Gulch. And this Mason, was integral in drafting that law. Also, a guy called Henry Allen, who was a great proponent of incorporating or founding the state of Jefferson. Of course, it would become to be known as Colorado, but immediately they started trying to get statehood for the territory of Pike's Peak country, which ultimately would emerge as Colorado. And I think this is also of interest, although not really surprising. It would emerge, in 1876, after the Civil War had ended and everything had kind of settled down a little bit. The state of Colorado would emerge along the very jurisdictional boundaries as the Grand Lodge of Colorado that was formed in 1861. But this no doubt shows that the York right was being conferred, at least in some capacity, and probably by a similar memorial right as early Masonry in the state, among the brethren here, at least as early as probably the early 1860s. I'm not sure if he was in Colorado when this picture was taken, although that is where it is alleged to have been taken from. I think I got it from the 59ers, it's called. It's a compilation of early founders of the state. Or it might have been from the Colorado Magazine. But either way, it was listed as being taken in Central City. That is subject to some debate, nonetheless. Now, I erroneously said in my talk for the Grand Lodge of California, for QC, Quarter Coronati, that was hosted by the Grand Lodge of California, that he disappears from the rolls. Well, he doesn't quite disappear from the rolls. It turns out, and I had a brother from Golden City Lodge number 1 contact me after the talk, and he sent me pertinent minutes. Unfortunately, William Train Muir was expelled from the Grand Lodge of Colorado for conducting a 3rd degree with less than the requisite number. So he doesn't necessarily disappear as much as is unceremoniously disposed of. There's a lot more I could say, but let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you, Andres. And this is what Denver looked like by 1898. So we go from essentially a prairie with one log cabin. That was the Russell Smith cabin, where the light of masonry was first shone as early November 1858. And by 1898, you have this stone metropolis, if you will, which is on rails almost, and the speed of this establishment, I think, is remarkable. And masonry is at the center of it. Without masonry, I'm not sure it would have had the organizing principle necessary to emerge with all these competing interests. So I realize that was rather fast and rapshod, but I'll be glad to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Thank you, Brother Ben. That was fascinating. We do have a few questions for you. Let's start with you just spoke of how masonry was at the middle of things in Colorado and Denver. What aspects of Colorado's pioneering roots do you think are still maintained in its Masonic culture?
Well, I wish it still had the same influence that it had back then. I mean, we can go back 100 years and really across the country, across the United States at the turn of the last century, or I guess the one before now, but at the turn of the 20th century, we had approximately the same number of Freemasons as we do today. And those brethren managed to build some of the most striking Masonic edifices, in the country. I think of how Telluride Lodge, which was built in a mining community, probably about 1898 is when they got their brick building built, having met in a tavern for a while, as Free Gold Lodge, it was called. They ended up buying a block after a fire, of course, and they built this wonderful brick lodge that was plumbed, and it was lit by alternating current. I believe that Telluride may have the first Masonic street sign to run on alternating current. That's just a guess, but it's an educated one. Well, they built this by floating bonds and the like. Today, I mean, we do have, a lot of a healthy contingent. We've gone down from about 10,000 Masons when I became a member back in 2006, and we're down to maybe 5,000. So our numbers are declining. We no longer, I think, have, we had a governor, for example, Evans, when he arrived here in the early 1860s, appointed as governor of the Colorado Territory by Abraham Lincoln, who was a personal friend of his. He was a brother. He was a Mason. He was a founding member of Union Lodge number 7, which is also a very interesting tale. Due to the the Civil War, Denver Lodge number 5 had a high contingency of Confederate supporters. So Unionists formed a new lodge, which they called Union Lodge number 7, in order to maintain brotherly love, because I'm imagining things were getting pretty heated. And Evans was, of course, a founding member of Union 7. Now, we had the second mayor of Denver. I don't think that I'm aware of anybody in sort of civic leadership who is a brother. I mean, we have judges, we have attorneys, we have tradesmen, we run the gamut, but we definitely don't have the same influence. And I think in a sense, obviously the Grand Lodge of Colorado was founded after the Morgan Affair had gone through its workings, but I'm not sure we really ever recovered from that here in the States. Or maybe we opened the doors back in the 40s and 50s and brought in just a whole bunch of people. I'm not sure. But I do know that we are beginning to grow again, at least in Colorado. We have a lot of interest among millennials looking for more than they're getting in society that are joining. The real question is, can we keep them? And I think we will. But I'm not sure if that answered the question.
It did. Thank you. The next question is, we often hear that America was forged in Masonic values, especially when it comes to state rights. Do you believe this is true, or is this just a romantic or revisionist theory?
No, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I am a romantic, but no, I think that's undeniably true. I mean, and I don't want to steal any thunder from another really amazing paper in this book about the Boston and the Green Dragon Tavern, St. Andrew's Lodge. But undeniably, in my opinion, Masonic values helped frame, in the same capacity that I mentioned before, this nexus for mutual relief, this moral code, this shared mythos, that we would have kind of a common memory between people that have never met. So we've been through a similar experience, which binds us together. And this forum for practicing self-governance. I mean, I think it's arguably you can trace the influence of the Constitution through the Articles of Confederation back to the Albany Plan of Union, back to Daniel Cox's Plan of Union for the Carolinas, back to Anderson's constitutions. You know, is it like a literal inspiration, or are they sharing from the same tree, so to speak? I don't think it really matters. I think that the fact that Masonry fomented and propagated these Enlightenment ideals, especially across an illiterate population, certainly helped stamp a Masonic resonance, if you like, into the fabric of the United States. I mean, the first book that Benjamin Franklin published for national distribution among the then 13 colonies was Anderson's Constitutions. I believe it was in 1734. First book that came off his press to be distributed, around the 13 colonies, Anderson's Constitution. So we know that Ben Franklin, a principal founder and framer of our American philosophy of self-governance, separation of powers, and so on, was intimately familiar with that text, because if he didn't set the type himself, he certainly oversaw it, as any good owner of a publishing company would, correct? So his familiarity with Anderson's Constitutions is, I think, certain and undeniably. In Colorado, there is just absolutely no doubt. I mean, the Masons founded the capital. We still I've got a quote in here that I can read. Now, this is from 1898. It was from Babbitt's Illustrated Guide of Colorado. Now, this was kind of prepared, I think, as a means to try to get people interested to come to the state, right? We see a lot of that because they want, folks to come so everybody can make money. But this is what it says. He said in Babbitt's Illustrated Guide, this is from 1891, it said, we make assertion, and the facts will prove it, that Denver has a larger membership in proportion to population in secret, benevolent, and social organizations than any city in the United States. Almost every secret and social order has a local representation. And I think that's partly because of Colorado is still a very kind of pluralistic state. Now, this is going to sound weird, but a lot of movies sort of are aired here, right? They want to test them out here because we're a very eclectic audience. They do a lot of testing of products out here because we've drawn people, and historically have done so, from all over the place. Originally for gold and the hope of wealth. Now because of skiing and the beautiful weather, right? So, but don't tell anybody. Shh, we don't. Nobody needs to know about how great it is in Colorado. Of course, we did recently legalize cannabis, as everyone's probably quite aware, and that certainly has had an effect. I think there were 40,000 people moving to Denver every month a few years back for 3 or 4 years in a row. So it's been a bit mental out here.
One last question, if I may. Do you
yeah.
believe American Freemasonry will ever be made up again of the types of individuals who go out and truly build? Or have American Masons laid too much of a time commitment on Freemasonry itself as a social or hierarchical organization with its teachings and inspiration?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I think it can and is and will be both. Right. I think the beautiful thing about Masonry is vivre la différence, as I think Brother Mike has put up there. Absolutely. But I'm going to go out on a limb and say what I think is even more incredible about Freemasonry is in such diversity and so many differences of workings. What makes us Masons is what makes us the same. There's some over unifying thing that makes us Freemasons. I do believe that we will once again comprise an element of our membership that is actively interested in building, because there's tons of work that needs to be done. I mean, to be fair, America is already bounded. We've already, there is no sort of untamed wilderness, sadly, where we can go out and make our discoveries. But we're always fighting that good fight, right? For representative governance, for individual autonomy, for human rights, right? These are, I believe, ingrained Masonic values. I mean, if you take the degree seriously, they're ingrained Masonic values. And America is a country that's troubled with its identity, and it has been for a long time. So we've always got the enemy to beat, because we are the enemy, right? So as long as there is self-improvement, Masons will build better men. And as long as there are better men, we'll build better societies. So I do long for the day where we are swelling again with members that are interested in the moral philosophy that Masonry inculcates, more than just simply the brotherhood that it facilitates. They're both very important. But I think that the former is the more transformative.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brother Ben.
Thank you.